Hi everyone, I'm Rob from Ethical Consumer. I guess this is a way of moving the slides on. I've got some slides that I prepared. I'm at the end of the day, so most of the issues have been covered, so I'm going to rattle through them pretty quickly. I noticed that we're meant to finish at 1:45, aren't we? And that means that we have to get me and two other speakers all speaking for 8 minutes by 1:45. So it's okay to run. I'm still going to do the 8 and we'll run on a bit if that's all right with the rest of you, I think. So that's the plan. I'm just going to do a little bit on who Ethical Consumer is. We're talking about moving forwards in this bit, and these are kind of things that I think we're going to see in the landscape going forwards. They've been around before, and these are the 4 points that I'm going to just say that we're going to observe. Who is Ethical Consumer? Very quickly, we're a campaigning cooperative whose mission is to make global business more sustainable through consumer pressure. We work in that space. We've heard a lot about what regulations could be and how they're going to change tax avoidance. It's going to take a lot of time to get that stuff there. And the things that consumers and activists can do is that we can operate quickly before all that stuff happens. We don't have to wait for global agreement. We can get in there and try and create some change. And that's kind of what we've been doing. We've been around in this space since 1997. You can just see the fifth line down on there. We noticed that Carrymore was in a tax haven when we were doing a buyer's guide on anoraks. There you go, which is perfect, really, isn't it? And we noticed that people elsewhere in Europe were concerned about tax avoidance right back in the 90s. This was an Italian development campaign group. You can see all the third line in from the right, if you can read upside down. It says Paradisi Fiscali, which is and so they were looking at tax avoidance of Colgate and Procter & Gamble right back in 1996, possibly as a higher awareness of tax avoidance in Italy in the 90s. But we've been looking at it for a very long time. We think it's symptomatic of a kind of general loss of moral compass by global multinationals that extends far beyond tax into a lot of the other areas that we look at. We saw a big change in concern around 2011. We had a conference in this room where we decided to organisationally have a three-pronged strategy. We decided to have a symbolic boycott of Amazon. We had a project to explore certification, which has ended up with Fair Tax Mark, with Richard and Paul. And we also wanted to work on local authority procurement because other purchasers, as well as consumers, can act quickly without waiting for regulation to happen. We were excited about what, and that's still happening. So, we've done a lot of surveying consumers on tax avoidance. We know that consumers, from a lot of the other speakers tonight, so I'm just going to rattle through these, they tend to show quite high levels of concern about tax avoidance. This is our own Fair Tax Mark survey this last month, published these last few days. I won't go into detail because we've seen all of those. One thing that I will show, this is a slide that I use often, not always speaking about tax. And if you look around the world, you see that consumers in surveys tend to segment themselves into these three groups. There's always 20 or 30% who are just not interested, whatever the issue, environment, tax, social problems, they're not interested. And there's a 5 to 10% of super ethical who are always going to follow you whatever you do. And then there's this big bit in the middle that is sometimes ethical. And this is the bit that makes it really interesting because the companies can't just ignore it. If it was just a little bit, the companies could probably get away with it. And these sometimes ethicals will sometimes just wake up and boycott you, and you can get into trouble. Often they're very slumbersome, if you like, and don't do a lot proactively. But sometimes they can be stirred, and that means that it's really hard to ignore them. We'll maybe, if we've got time, we'll come back to that issue. So naming and shaming and boycotts is one of the kind of things that has really driven a kind of focus, particularly amongst the financially minded corporations, because they've realised that there's actually a potential to lose money in this space. Something's got a bit wonky with the slides, but we can see one of the really interesting things about the Starbucks boycott is that we've got really hard evidence about the economic impact, and cost coffee sales up quite significantly at that point. There were probably hundreds of millions of pounds transferred over a period of a few months from one coffee company to another. And that was the thing that really woke people up about the potential for this kind of kickback impact if you were caught avoiding. We also, naming and shaming, this point is just to say that Fortune and Reuters, naming and shaming isn't just lefties like us, it's mainstream organisations are pretty concerned about this, and even the HM Revenue is getting involved in it, although it's looking at much smaller organisations when it names and shames. So we've got naming and shaming, benchmarking, companies' performance on tax avoidance is something that I think we'll see more of in the future, and this is one of the things that will help us kind of manage performance. This is Fair Tax Mark's own thing. It did it on the local authority pension funds. It did an analysis of their tax strategy reporting. The second paragraph, 66% were non-compliant and scored 0. That's probably the most interesting statistic on that. We haven't got time to look at the rest of it. But that's the first time Fair Tax Mark has been involved in benchmarking, particularly. This is Ethical Consumers' own benchmarking of bookshops and their tax avoidance. The red ones are tax avoiders, and the green ones are not tax avoiders. Amazon and Waterstones and Apple are up there in the red box. So we're providing information following consumer demand on tax avoidance. We're doing benchmarking. Consumers are demanding it. That's one example of it. B corporations are another kind of vaguely consumer-facing initiative that are looking at responsible corporate behaviour. They've now got tax avoidance in their disclosure questionnaires, and they're counting that as one of the things they look at. We've also got ethical investors looking at it. One of the other speakers, I hope, is going to say a little bit more about that later, so I won't go on about it. So we've looked at naming and shaming, we've looked at benchmarking. We're probably going to see more of that in the future. The other thing that we can see a little bit more about is people who are convinced about tax avoidance are now looking at their own, as a problem, and now looking at their own supply chains, and are beginning to kind of just try and create some economic impact down there. So Ethical Consumer, we do risk screening services to charities for their supply chains, and development charities, fairly understandably, they don't want to work with companies, buy their services or take their money from ones involved in aggressive tax avoidance. Seem to have gone 2 there. No, we haven't. So there we go. Some companies are also keen to look at tax avoidance in their supply chains. We know, for example, Mid-Counties Co-op have considered tax avoidance when choosing coffee shops to partner with in their stores. It's a fairly obvious where that one was going. And also, there's still considerable interest from public authorities to consider tax avoidance in procurement criteria. Fair Tax Mark have got a number of exciting projects lined up in this area for 2018. One of the first is a roundtable on the subject at Christian Aid in Fair Tax Fortnight. So we think there's important movement going to happen around that area. So that was moving forward, consumers and tax avoidance. I've looked at those 4 issues which were meant to come up on the slide, so we can just go back to recap what the issues were. Hang on, one more. There they were. So in the future, we'll see surveys probably saying the same things about consumers. We'll see naming and shaming and boycotts. We'll see benchmarking, and we'll see supply chain activity. I'm just going to go to this slide one more time and just explain a couple of things about what this means. So, all right, I'm up against time. So, very briefly, so consumers are the wild card in this space. They're unpredictable, but in a sense, this is an advantage to campaigners because companies don't actually know whether they're going to come and bite them on the bum. So, we know that. But they won't always. But one thing we do know that they will do always is that if you're Fair Tax Mark accredited, or if you're doing good things in the CSR space, it makes your consumers more sticky. They're less likely to leave you. So although you're not likely to attract many more, you're going to retain the ones that you've got because they like you better. You will maybe attract some of these always ethicals, a small proportion of them, but they do become sticky CSR-focused businesses. So I think that's probably where we're going to finish. So we've got some more people to speak, so I'll let you get on with them. Thanks very much.